Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marissa Khurma, the Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Middle East Program, as well as our co-hosts, the Asia Program, I'd like to welcome you all here today to our special event, The Road Ahead for I2U2, an American, Emirati, Israeli, and Indian partnership. We're truly honored to be hosting our keynote speaker, Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, Jose Fernandez, whose remarks on I2U2 will then be followed by an expert panel discussion moderated by Ambassador Charlie Rees. I'd like to now welcome Ambassador Mark Green, the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, whose leadership and experience throughout the years, whether as administrator of USAID or the president of the International Republican Institute or the McCain Institute, has always focused on various aspects of economic growth as well as human development, which in turn is an ongoing process, a journey of progress and lessons learned, always done better through partnerships, cooperation, and collaborative action, much like I2U2 and what it promises. So, Ambassador Green, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marissa. Good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center for today's special event, a discussion on the present and the future of the I2U2 Quadrilateral Forum. While the New York Times has described I2U2 as sounding something like a cross between a legendary Irish rock band and a Star Wars droid, in reality, what it represents is something far more exciting and far more powerful than rock music or science fiction. Because while it's hard power that occupies governments and violence that captures headlines, it's the power of markets and commerce and entrepreneurship that makes progress around the world. I2U2 is pragmatic because it looks to the common interests of the parties in accelerating economic opportunities in each of their countries and all of their countries. But it also represents hope and aspiration because it seeks to harness the power of collaboration inside a region that has often been paralyzed with strife. The U.S., Israel, India, and the UAE, to better understand the political and economic dynamics that brought this group together, we're fortunate to have with us Undersecretary for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, Jose Fernandez. He'll offer the U.S. perspective on I2U2 and what America sees as the collaboration's potential. Now, the Undersecretary leads the State Department's work on many of the issues at the center of the Biden administration's priorities: climate change, clean energy, health, supply chain security, and other economic priorities. He's in the middle of all of it. And because the Wilson Center is dedicated to independent scholarship and objective analysis, as you just heard from Marissa, we'll follow the Undersecretary's remarks with a special panel of experts. They'll help us explore the regional context of I2U2, especially in light of great power competition and the historic achievement of the Abraham Accords. So without further ado, and for all of us to learn more, Mr. Undersecretary, welcome. It's good to have you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. And let me just commend you for bringing us all together. It's important that we talk about this initiative, and it's also good to see a couple of Ambassador Herzog here, and of course Ambassador Jeffries and other colleagues in the room. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a quick introduction into I2U2, and the first thing I'll say is that I'm not responsible for the name. This is something that Secretary Blinken was very keen on, and he liked that idea, and that's something that once he decided that we ought to pursue it, it's something that we all took it upon ourselves to give it a moniker. The I2U2 group comprises the U.S., Israel, India, and the UAE, And it was formed during Secretary Blinken's ministerial call with his I2 counterparts back in October of last year. And it was officially launched by President Biden at the first I2U2 leaders meeting in July during his trip to the region. It came together very quickly. It's something that we had been working on for really only a few months, but the interest was there, and because it was a good model, we decided we had stumbled on something that we ought to really expand and pursue. What I2U2 does is it focuses narrowly on advancing mutually beneficial economic opportunities. It's a partnership that's based on cooperation and not on competition. It's a new regional platform to deepen economic integration with the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. It's also a model for promoting trusted regional partnerships that can create collaborative commercial opportunities. And it also supports the administration's support for building on the Abraham Accords and further Israel's economic integration in the broader region. The I2U2 initiative sets a standard for working together for solutions, and we've decided to, at first, focus on 6 challenges in the region: energy, food security, health, space, transportation, and water. And the 2 initial projects that President Biden announced in July promoted food security and clean energy in India. They're innovative, they were ambitious, they're achievable, and they're commercially viable. My 3 counterparts and I, from the I2U2 initiative, met for the first time in September of last year. Before that, we'd had Zoom calls and for almost a year, and had actually gotten to know each other quite well as you can on Zoom. But we met in person on the margins of the UN General Assembly back in September, and we had a productive discussion on the status of the projects. These are projects that are multi-billion-dollar, multi-million-dollar projects that those of you who've done these kinds of projects realize that it takes time. They take time to coalesce, but we are very hopeful with the progress. We're pleased with the progress, and we expect them to keep going forward. But back in September, something else that we discussed was the road ahead for I2U2. And we're working closely to explore additional projects to tackle food insecurity and possibly advance space cooperation. And while we will initially focus on initiatives in the 4 I2U2 countries, we also hope to explore opportunities in other parts of the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. And we're also thinking of broadening the scope beyond the 6 areas that I mentioned earlier to include technology and semiconductors. What we're hoping to do, and this is, if you take anything away from my couple of minutes intervention today, we aim to discuss these and other opportunities at a business forum that is being planned by the UAE in Dubai early next year. It's the I2U2 Business Forum, where we're hoping to bring together businesses and investors to identify ways that industry can benefit from existing I2U2 initiatives and also brainstorm future projects. You know, this is what we're trying to do is something that diplomats aren't terribly used to doing, and that is bring together projects, act in some ways as developers, as project developers. And part of what we need to do is to get ideas, get leads, really, from countries. So the road ahead is busy. In the longer term, we're hoping that the I2U2 model will be expanded and will be replicated to bring about broader change. You know, I2U2 gives us tools. We realize that in the U.S. government, to give you an example, we have the DFC, we have Exim Bank, we have a number of tools already. But what I2U2 does is it gives us a platform. Gives us a platform to try to bring those tools together and to cooperate with countries that have the same tools or have different tools to bring about a project. And why are we doing this? Well, we're doing it for many reasons, but one of them is that the world stands at a pivotal moment right now. We're grappling with multiple interconnected crises, supply chain disruptions across the world, that stemmed from COVID-19, from the pandemic, and that were exacerbated by Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. They've created serious challenges for the world's global food and for energy supplies. But in addition, as you well know, climate change is a clear and present threat. It's here now, and it impacts our activities every day. What this means to me, what this means to the administration, is that in order to tackle these issues, we have to mobilize private capital. And that's yet another purpose of I2U2. And I think the progress that we've been fortunate to make with I2U2, it shows that mini-laterals, small groupings, mini-laterals like I2U2 are the way of the future. And why? They're focused, they're agile, and if we do them right, they are going to bring results. So my hope for coming here this afternoon is to hear some of the opportunities, hear about some of the opportunities that will be discussed today. I look forward to a readout from my friends and colleagues here at the Wilson Center, and please bring us deals. We need more deals, and if we're able to have 10, 15 projects in the door, maybe a couple of them will be brought to reality, and that's the way that these things work. So thank you again, Ambassador Green. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you to the Wilson Center, and have a good afternoon, and I look forward to hearing about the conclusions from this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Undersecretary Fernandez, for those very thought-provoking comments. I heard about the theme of working together with partners on shared interests multilaterally, which I think is certainly something we could all support. My name is Michael Kugelman. I direct the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. We are now going to transition into our panel discussion on I2U2, and I'm honored to introduce the panelists and the moderator. We have with us Afshin Molavi, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS, Dr. Deepa Olapalli, research professor of international affairs and director of the Rising Powers Initiative at the Elliott School at GW, Dr. Natan Sachs, director for the Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings, where he is also a senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Program. And last but not least, Ambassador James Jeffrey, my colleague at the Wilson Center, who is chair of the Middle East Program. And the chair of our panel discussion is Ambassador Charles Rees, adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation. And I now turn things over to Ambassador Rees.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. My thanks to the Wilson Center for pulling this together, to Undersecretary Fernandez for starting us off with his own perspectives and the U.S. government's perspectives on what we have here. It is a fantastic panel. I look forward to drawing out some of the implications for the various participating countries and where this might go, which is, I think, the road ahead part of our discussion. So let's get right to it. I guess I might mention that we expect to end with a few minutes for questions and answers, and including from our online audience, which will make their questions known to the staff through the chat function, I believe. Just checking on that. Anyway, let me start with Deepa, because the first two announced projects for the I2U2 initiative are actually in India, with investment from the UAE and technological support from the United States and from Israel. How is the venture seen from Delhi? Does Delhi see this as primarily or exclusively an economic an investment initiative, or is there some deeper significance to the grouping and to the initiative from the standpoint of Indian foreign policy?
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think from the Indian perspective, the I2U2 could be a game changer. So just beyond investments and the economic sphere, I think it's more than that. I know that many people look at this as kind of an incremental, yet another minilateral. I think in the case of New Delhi, it's a lot more than just incrementalism. It provides what I think is a strategic and economic opening into a region that's always been important for India, but it has been focusing for the last 10 years or so on the Indo-Pacific. And I think this, and of course the pandemic and what the Undersecretary said about the disruptions in the supply chain, in all of the insecurities that have come up, I think India also sees it as a way to distribute a kind of resiliency by distributing its capabilities and resources that it can go to. And so the Make in India objective that Mr. Modi has had, which has not been very successful so far, in part because of lack of investments and because of a lot of the bottlenecks within India. But I think this is a very key pipeline for that economically. So I think it is important economically. But I would say that India already has very important, economic relations with the UAE. It's the third largest trading partner after US and China. It's got excellent relations, economic, defense, commercial relations with Israel. So I think that India already has economic flows that are quite strong. So what this initiative and the ventures do is to make it a bigger opportunity to play a bigger look west policy for India that I think has been looking very much eastward, but there hasn't been an opportunity for India to be a player in a very challenging region of the world. India has been kind of a bystander. It's had its anchor in Iran, for example. It gives India more choices. It diversifies its partnerships economically and politically. And it doesn't have to choose. I think this is so I see it in a slightly bigger fashion than just the economics, but not to belittle the economics, because clearly they're talking about hundreds of thousands of new jobs, for example, that's being expected. And so I definitely think that it's, but first and foremost, I think the newness about it is beyond economics.
Well, we'll come back to the economics too, but that's very useful. Natan, can you tell me how it's seen from Jerusalem? I mean, what's the difference, in a sense, and significance of I2U2 compared to the Abraham Accords? How does it fit in with the Abraham Accords' view of the future? And do you expect any change in attitude towards this initiative if Mr. Netanyahu becomes prime minister?
Well, thank you very much.
As it looks like.
As it looks very likely. It's a pleasure to be here. The Israelis, of course, are extremely happy about this. Many of them will point out that it was an Israeli idea, in fact, at a trilateral in October last year here in Washington with Secretary Blinken. It was Alon Ushpiz, I hear, who was, in fact, the person who came up with the idea of calling in the Indians, because the following week, Foreign Minister Jaishankar was going to be in Israel. And so it followed very quickly, as we heard from the Undersecretary of State. And the reason it was obviously very welcomed by the Israelis is that it fits in very well with their attitude towards foreign relations right now, which they tend to call geometric diplomacy. So the idea is that in large international organizations, the UN being the prime example, Israel is at a historic disadvantage and is, to say the least, not terribly happy with the UN in many cases. And on the other hand, in very small groupings, it can use international and even multilateral organizations to try and move things forward. So it has a preference now for these ad hoc groupings. The Abraham Accord is an obvious one. But the Abraham Accord started, of course, without any official gathering. And so we saw just in the past year and a half, we saw the Negev Forum come together, which has much more of an organization and much more heft behind it at the moment, with working groups and quite a bit behind it following the Abraham Accords, but also bringing in the Egyptians. And we saw Secretary Blinken there as well as a founding member of the Negev Forum, which will continue and will continue to be called the Negev Forum. In that sense, I2U2 fits in very well. I'll say behind the scene, I2U2 fits in for complementarity reasons. The 4 countries are very, very different in terms of their size and their capacities and their comparative advantages. That's wonderful. It's wonderful for business. The question always arises, if it's so great for business, why do we need the diplomats, right? The business could do it on its own, and I don't think it's trivial here. The diplomatic structure can give real promise, real regulatory help, real support in governmental approval, which is sometimes important in some of these countries at least, and we see already the economic possibilities. I think there's also an underlying question. If you speak to Americans about the I2U2, they will stress about 1,000 times that it has nothing to do with China. And they do seem to protest slightly too much. I can tell you that for the Israelis, it really is not about China, and I suspect it's not the case for the other partners as well. But it is to a certain degree about the United States. The United States had sort of a hegemonic moment in the Middle East, and that's passed, and it does not seem like the United States wants to go back to that. Partners of the United States in the region, on the other hand, would love to tie Gulliver down a little bit and make sure the United States can't leave. So here's one more forum, not a huge one, but an important one, that can tie the United States in a productive way into areas where the United States has its interests as well, and where it can partner with its traditional partners. So for the Israelis, it's sort of a win-win-win. There's no doubt, there's almost no downside. Cooperation with countries that Israel is very interested in cooperating with, both India and the UAE certainly, bringing in the United States and perhaps shackling it a little bit to these kinds of organizations, and providing a new avenue. It has quite a few going westward into the Mediterranean, now a new avenue going eastward all the way to India that can bring this kind of geometric diplomacy to the fore for the Israelis. So in short, super popular in Israel. You asked one last question and I'll finish quickly. Super popular in Israel, but a product of the Bennett-Lapid government. Very soon Netanyahu will be prime minister, perhaps next week. And there is a question. Will he continue this? Will he keep the mantle up? I suspect yes. There's very little downside. But will he love to use the same moniker and give credit to his predecessor? It's not something that most politicians are known for. It's quite possible that he will decide that there's one extremely important flaw that he can correct. It will become the I2U2 plus, and then he can champion it as a Netanyahu cause, which I think would be wonderful. But Netanyahu or not Netanyahu, this organization lacks a mechanism. It lacks bureaucracy. There is no one in the world is staffing I2U2 full time. And so with that, with political interests that may be slightly disaligned, it's possible that this will not have the same energy that it would otherwise.
On the Secretariat side, I have to say that my youth, I worked on G7 issues, and one of the advantages in the field of bureaucratic institutions of the G7 is that it doesn't exist. It doesn't have a permanent bureaucracy. Every president for the next meeting provides the ideas and the staff and so forth. There are good things and bad things about that, but it's not unprecedented even at this level of international stuff. So, Afshin, let me turn to you. I'd like to know how the I2U2 is seen from the Emirati point of view. Is it part and parcel, or a new departure, an economic statecraft for Abu Dhabi? Does it have these other, shall we call them, echoes of the multilateral and the sort of geopolitical situation that Natan was mentioning?
Great, thank you very much. Good question, and it's so great to be back at the Wilson Center. This is a place many years ago. I had my first public policy fellowships. I have fond memories here. When I think about the UAE and I2U2, I think we should zoom out for a moment. And let's zoom out and just think about the UAE as a geo-economic actor, right? So this is a country, it's a small country, less than 10 million people, but it does more international trade than Brazil or Indonesia, just to give you an example, right, of countries of 200 million plus. This is a country that has really set itself up as a global trade hub, but also, a center of connectivity. It has set itself up. It's also one of the largest outward investors in West Asia. So it's clearly a major geoeconomic actor. If any of you have been to Jebel Ali Port in Dubai or Khalifa Port in Abu Dhabi, I mean, you see globalization before your very eyes. Containers as far as the eye can see. So I think that's important to note, is just the UAE as a geoeconomic actor. And then, in many ways, it's the Singapore-Hong Kong model. You build the infrastructure of connectivity, and they will come. And then you add this layer of outward investment. Consistently one of the largest outward investors from West Asia, all across Africa, all across the Middle East. So So you, in the Southeast Arabian Peninsula, you have this, country that's just, young, it's 50 years old, and is this geoeconomic actor with, 0.13% of the world's population that handles 2.4% of the world's sea container trade. So that's not something small. Now, you add another layer to this. So the UAE over the past 18 months or so has been laying out a new foreign policy doctrine. And in this new foreign policy doctrine, they've signaled it pretty clearly to all of us and anyone who's been watching. I ended up calling it the economy first doctrine. Because they put out a document in September of 2021 called the Projects of the 50 document. I recommend you all look at it, and they lay out their vision for the next 50 years or so in the UAE and commemorate their past 50 years. And in that document, I'll quote directly from it. They say the Emirates' foreign policy is a tool that aims to serve our higher national goals, the most important of which is the Emirates' economic interest. So they say it in point blank. They say the economic development of the country is the supreme national interest, and all state institutions in all fields and across different federal and local levels shall bear the responsibility of building the best global economic environment and maintaining the gains achieved in the past 50 years. So these two, I think, have to be put into context. It's a geoeconomic actor that punches above its weight, and it actually has stated to the world that we're going to put the economy first in many ways. And then you look at these specific relationships that the UAE already had with these three parties. The UAE-India relationship, robust, dynamic, $65 to $70 billion in trade. There's 3.5 million Indians living in the UAE. The joke among professional expatriate Indians in Dubai is, what's the best city in India? And the answer is Dubai is the best city in India. And on and on. So you have these, Bollywood hosts premieres and events in Dubai. And so you have this robust relationship that already existed before I2U2. Right, and so then they recently signed a UAE-India free trade agreement, and they're aiming for $100 billion in trade over the next 3 to 5 years. And then you look at the UAE-US relationship, a $23 billion trade relationship. One of the few countries where we run a trade surplus, actually, is the UAE, because the UAE doesn't send much, if any, oil at all to the United States. And then you look at the UAE-Israel relationship, which is fascinating, because this is not a cold peace. Both countries are leaning into this relationship. You've got about $1 billion in trade already, just like that, with the snap of the fingers. So when you look at the I2U2, the way I look at it is, the question was asked, why do we need the diplomats? And in some ways, it's a salient question, but I view it as more like the BRICS. Where you have a group of countries that are brought together, they convene occasionally, and they align themselves in certain ways geoeconomically, but the BRICS are not aligned all geopolitically. And so the I2U2 is not a place for geopolitical alignment, but it is a place where you're going to find, and the last point I'll make is that UAE officials like to often say that you can't clap with one hand. And so, so it's the classic example of the multilateral challenges, whether it's climate, whether it's food security, and bringing countries together. But so I just draw a line. I say these relationships are dynamic and growing beyond the I2U2. The I2U2 adds another layer to it.
Well, so Jim, we've heard that Israel, India, and the Emirates all see this quite the way that Undersecretary Fernandez sees it, as an economic initiative, a mini-lateral, the new term of the year, I think, initiative, but with strategic overtones. Do you agree with that? I mean, these three countries, the other three countries in this quadrilateral venture, all are a little softer, shall we say, on the Russians in the Ukraine struggle than the United States and European allies are, despite the fact that Undersecretary Fernandez protests that that's not the purpose. Is that a purpose for the United States? And do you see this as becoming an initiative for the ages or an initiative of the moment?
Let me start with the last. Time will tell. Once upon a time, we thought the Baghdad Pact was a cornerstone of our policy in the Middle East, and it didn't go very far. But then we saw the Marshall Plan, which turned into the OECD.
The
and
Baghdad Pact that established CENTO.
Right, and then established
John
CENTO,
Foster
which
Dulles.
then went down.
Just for explanation.
Yeah, it became CENTO. We're going to go back and forth. And it became CENTO after the Baghdad Pact. Baghdad switched sides. But anyway, but we're actually talking about the same thing. And I can't presume to interpret Secretary Fernandez's hard-hitting and very concise summary of where the U.S. is on this. It's absolutely correct that this is not focused on any specific country as an opponent, nor even on security per se. That word doesn't appear in the entire document. But it's all about security. To quote from the Biden administration's just out national security strategy, one of the few I've ever seen worth reading, it's all about, America's role in the world is all about freedom and openness, prosperity and peace. It sees this as a unitary set of attributes of a global order, which is basically an order of orders. This is nothing new. We did much of it in the late 1940s with things like the Bretton Woods system, and as I said, the Marshall Plan, and what flowed from those things, institutions that are still with us today. You don't have a binary break between private sector and public sector, between hard power and soft power. When this overall system of systems is challenged by hard power, which we see in Ukraine, we may well see in Taiwan, we see at the regional level with Iran and North Korea, you can't just respond with hard power. You have to respond with a system that is so robust and resilient that countries are going to pick places on the spectrum, and as diplomats, we're offering them this smorgasbord of things to do, all the way up to becoming the infantry in one of our distant, never-ending wars, down to don't vote against us in the UN. And what we want them to do on that spectrum is to choose things that will reinforce the global order, which has an inherent security element. Those container ships running around the world, those undersea gas pipelines are there, and we count on them for our prosperity and our way of life because we expect they're not going to get blown up all the time, or they're not going to be involved in international trade in a world that is split into warring blocs as like 1914 to 1945. So in that sense, and this is all, it's not just informal, it's almost subconscious. You build up layers of integrated relationships between security providing elements and economic and diplomatic cooperation and enhancement, and in ways that are hard to describe, but we're looking at it before our very eyes in the whole struggle over Ukraine right now. It plays a huge role. We don't know how big a role this will play, but it's a step in the right direction, and it will not only enhance, I think, security, or it has a good chance of doing it, it also, by ways that nobody, certainly in the Foreign Service, knows better than Charlie Reese, with government not running economies, but government providing the infrastructure and the frameworks, from trade to financial to monetary to other policies that allow private sectors to place their bets and predict the future. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And I guess the answer from all four of you is that it is about economics and trade, but it's about more than that. Because it's about economics and trade, it has more than that in terms of significance. But I'd like to drill down a little bit for a moment on the economics and trade. I mean, these first two projects that were announced on the margins of the summit meeting in July. One is a food security project, and the other one is a sort of renewable energy project. The renewable energy project as far as I know, grew out of a Trade and Development Agency feasibility study, and it was kind of on the shelf. The food security or food technology, food park or something like that in Gujarat. Is that Gujarat? Would these things have happened anyway? I mean, is the significance of I2U2 highlighting them that they have an easier regulatory pathway through the Indian process? I mean, does it? Because it would seem to me that if you make a big deal about these two first projects, if either of them fail, or the investors say, the private investors say, well, the numbers don't quite work for us, we're going to withdraw from this. This has these bigger consequences, which would be actually quite difficult to manage. So, as you see it, Deepa, do you think that these are so much slam dunk projects that they will succeed anyway, but then they would have happened anyway, maybe?
A good question, and I think it is going to be an issue about whether it's going to be a kind of model for the rest of the economic relationships. First of all, these projects are going to be mostly in Gujarat, which is important because that is the Prime Minister Modi's home base. It is also a state well known for delivering the goods, for being extremely hospitable to the business. Mm-hmm. And many businesses have gone from, say, Bengal, the Tatas. Indian big businesses have moved from other states because of lack of welcoming business climate, and has gone to Gujarat. So Gujarat, I think, was chosen for good reasons, and because it is, the Prime Minister himself is pretty much invested in it, I think it's going to happen in a successful fashion, okay? They can't afford not to make it work. And as I said, I think the regulatory systems, the tax, the bureaucracy and all that there is just a lot easier for businesses. So that's one, just on the economic. Mm-hmm. And we also, as I said, have the political investment from at the very highest level for this. Would it have happened without the kickstarting from the I2U2? I think it would have been much slower, frankly, because, as I said, Make in India, the economic priorities that Mr. Modi has been putting to the forefront since he came in 2014 have not worked.
Right.
Not much to show for it. Employment figures that were, 10 million a year and so forth, that was the ambitious goal, have not happened. These are critical steps for that. So I think there's another drive toward that. It's just not suddenly there's I2U2 and hey, there are these projects that have come our way, let's grab them. No, I think this is building on some economic substructures that have been moving, but fast forwarding them now. Mm-hmm. And, it's a hypothetical question whether it would have happened. Again, the U.S.-Israel part of it, U.S. is a key integrator in the I2U2. My feeling is that without the United States, we would not have seen this group coming together in the way it does, and I hope that the U.S., I think it has to stay engaged in order to maintain that momentum.
Well, you mentioned earlier that it was a way to for India, which was looking east as its main vector for economic development, to turn west. And is that because of the involvement of the United States?
I think again, as my colleague mentioned, India and Abu Dhabi in particular have had extraordinarily, historically strong trade ties. India signed this Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in June this year, actually February this year, and then started in June. It's the first one that it had after 10 years. The last one it had was with Malaysia, and then before that, ASEAN. No free trade agreements until this. That's a huge thing. And they made it happen in, I think, like 8 months. Last time, it took 10 years for the ASEAN agreement. So it was, but then India did not have a mechanism or a role to play the kind of amplify its already big economic role in a more geostrategic fashion. That's why I see it as more than economic for India. It's a way to circumvent Pakistan to the west, compete with China in the Middle East. And I think there is certainly an undertone of competition with China, at least from New Delhi's side. No one is going to say that openly, but there it is.
Okay, well, thank you for saying it then. Natan, talk to me about the Israeli business community, the Israeli private sector. How did they see this? I mean, for them, is the big prize India, or is the big prize the Emirates, or is it just finding new big markets to work with American companies?
Well, I2U2 per se, especially with that name, is not a huge deal because most people are not discussing it. It's not yet a phrase that's coined, and I'm glad to hear that Secretary Blinken loves the name because I don't know of anyone else who's loved the name so far, including the National Security Advisor who commented on it. But the Israeli business community is very heavily involved in India already.
Right.
And in just recent years, since the Abraham Accords, we've seen, as we heard from Afshin, we've seen a skyrocketing of trade with the UAE. But the real answer to the question is it depends whom. So inside the Israeli business community, you have very different shades of business. Of course, Israel is a heavy exporter now of arms and other defense technology. Certainly the UAE, some of it published not by the governments. India as well, a huge trade partner in terms of defense. The United States and Israel goes without saying. So defense has been extremely central to it. Cyber and other issues that are sort of adjacent to defense have also been big, but there's a lot of room to grow. There are other things, however, that have also been very important, especially in Israeli-Indian trade. Israel has a lot of advanced technology in terms of agriculture and water-scarce agriculture, which has been extremely important. Israel, of course, is half desert, basically, even more than half is desert. And so there's a lot of experience there. And so India, with the vast variety of climates in India, there's been a lot of market for that. But there's still an enormous room to grow. So for the Israeli business community, it very much depends who. And I think many of the people behind I2U2 also don't mind the idea of here's a deal that is not only about the defense sector moving. It's not just going to be anti-ballistic missiles being sold around the world, but perhaps other things as well. Not just surveillance and ability for governments to control their own citizens, but also things that will advance welfare writ large. And so there's a huge capacity there. I'd say when you add the UAE, you really do get remarkable complementarity. The UAE has been, of course, a major attraction for Israeli businesses recently. As one person once put it to me not too long ago, it's very nice to have very rich neighbors or very rich friends. But of course, that only goes so far. The question is, what is the real advantage and mutual advantage in deals? And with a market like India's, you can see an enormous advantage there. I'll say one last thing, which is that Israel until 1992 had a direct boycott and also a secondary boycott. So there was a lot of difficulty for Israelis doing business abroad. And long after that, Israel had difficulty doing business in many parts of the Muslim world up until today. India was often a place where Israeli businesses found a mechanism around that. You would have a subsidiary in India, or not a subsidiary, but a partner in India. They would sell in Indonesia or even Malaysia or other places that is harder for Israeli businesses to do. I used to live in Indonesia. There was quite a bit of business that was Indian, but also Israeli somewhere in the background. That can now come a bit more to the fore, and with the Emirati cooperation here, even more so.
One of our charges is to think about the road ahead. And I wonder, Afshin, could you talk to me, are there other countries that might be, I mean, you have to change the name, right? If
Right.
Egypt came in or something like that. What are those countries? What would that mean for the organization? Are there any other sort of natural fits for this, or is this a one-off?
No, I think there's going to be other countries that are going to be knocking on the door. And maybe one way you don't have to change the name too much is you invite Indonesia and the United Kingdom, and it could be the I3U3. But no, and those are legit. Those are legit. The United Arab Emirates and Indonesia have signed free trade agreements. The UK and India, in fact, are now talking about a free
Banging
trade
their
agreement.
heads against the wall
Yeah.
has not been very successful.
Right,
in
right.
Particular
It
negotiation.
will not be in. It will not take place in 8 months.
Oh.
Certainly not. No. But then you would think of Japan. You would think of South Korea. You would think of other. When you look around at particularly the UAE's trade profile, it's heavily Asian. It's very commercially Asian. The UAE, the top 8 of the 8 countries that UAE exports to are all in Asia. And so you see there's Japan, South Korea. Japan has traditionally been a major buyer of UAE oil. So I think I'd look at Japan, South Korea. I would look at Indonesia. I'd look at the United Kingdom as well. Those are the ones that come immediately to mind.
Well, this is an organization thus far without any binding obligations, so it might be relatively easy to join.
Okay.
Jim, last question for you, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We are entering another highly political environment in the U.S. Between now and 24. How might the sort of distraction of the U.S. system on domestic politics, the next presidential race, the divided Congress, have an impact on this kind of thing? Does this make the administration sort of traditionally more interested in foreign policy initiatives, or could it be that the distraction and the lack of support from the opposition party for an initiative that is so much identified with Secretary Blinken and President Biden be more difficult?
I'm optimistic. I'll tell you why in a second. But to jump into your last question, my vote would be I2U2 and friends. I'm thinking immediately of it does have an organic connection to the Negev Forum, and that brings in Bahrain and Morocco. It brings in indirectly Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, and now we're talking about major economic players, and Egypt, another one. So I'm pretty optimistic. Now, in terms of the reaction, I have a theory that not everybody will share with me, that, and I think we just went through a real experience from 2016 to 2020, that American foreign policy is more resilient and more consistent than we might think. The politics of American foreign policy goes up and down with a lot of Sturm und Drang, but the basics remain. A good example is the Abraham Accords. We are celebrating, actually a little earlier this month, with the Bahrain Forum, the first time the words Abraham Accords came out of the mouth of an American member of the administration. It was Brett McGurk on a forum in Bahrain with his Israeli counterpart. And he said it twice. The day before, Lloyd Austin, who had been positive on it almost a year before, talked about it at length but couldn't say the words. I think that's indicative of the politics of foreign policy. People will be reluctant, if a new administration comes in, to embrace the I2U2, but the concept in the unofficial system behind it, they will embrace, in particular in this case, because it brings in Israel, which is still in Republican ranks, a very popular subject. It brings in business opportunities, also popular. And indirectly, as we've been debating for the last 45 minutes, another forum, a vehicle to challenge, or not contest with China in particular, but also Russia. And China is an obsession certainly with President Trump and with many in the Republican Party. So I think this is going to be a winner, but don't expect them to say it publicly.
Okay. We have room for a few questions in the audience, one right there in the middle. Perhaps you could introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, I'm Guy Laron. I'm a fellow at the Wilson Center this year. Thank you very much for this discussion. It was very interesting. Still, I have a question to the whole panel. It was said that this forum is about security and that the economies of the partners complement each other. So security of what, and complement each other how? And I can offer a theory that seems to be in the air in this discussion, that basically it's about Modi's India recruiting Israeli technology, agricultural technology, with UAE funding and energy. And the security is food security for Israel and the UAE, something I think that those governments are concerned about a lot when they look at the coming decades and, of course, on climate change.
Any comment on that?
Sure, I can take it briefly. I don't think it's about security. The I2U2. I do think it is predominantly geo-commercial, geo-economic. And when you look at it from the perspective of, say, if you are Israel or India, and you're looking at the UAE. The UAE is many ways. It's two or three things. It's one, it's the capital, absolutely. You've got sovereign wealth funds with $1 trillion plus in assets in the UAE, and then you also have state-owned enterprises that are pretty nimble and dynamic, like DP World, investing in ports around the world, Etisalat investing in telecommunications around the world, Mubadala investing around the world, companies like Borouge and petrochemical. So you have this platform of companies that can invest around the world, but then you also have that connectivity platform, right? So if you plug into that, it's kind of plugging into an app. You plug into that app, boom, you've got access to the world via the ports, via the air connectivity. China, the reason that China sends so much goods to the UAE, a country of 10 million people can't take as many goods as China sends to the UAE, is because of the re-exports, right? And so if you are, and for a while before COVID, the UAE was India's air gateway to the world. 1 in every 3 international flights that left India landed in the UAE, and 1 in every 3 international flights that landed in India emanated from the UAE. So it's the capital, and it's the kind of connectivity platform that the UAE provides as well for countries and companies. That I think that's where the complementary part fits in.
Anybody else? Another question for the audience, or yeah.
Just a point on this. I think complementarity, you're right. The complementarity is sort of quite clear. You have the UAE with enormous capital, but also quite a bit of technology. It's not just capital. Israel with obviously technology of a variety of different kinds. In theory, one day defense, perhaps two. We already have defense. We see defense already between Israel and India, Israel and the UAE. You could imagine trilateral or quadrilateral with the United States as well. And let's not forget the United States with capital, technology, and a market as well. So there's a lot going on. I think, Deepa's point in the beginning is maybe the most interesting one. India looking west, that's what really changes here. You already have the others in the Negev Forum. You already have the others with the Abraham Accords. Bringing India in is the very interesting one, and one that I think offers some potential here. But I don't want to give the false impression. It's not that I2U2 is not changing the face of commerce between these countries. It's not. It gives one more form to it, and it can offer, obviously, the security aspects because one more building block, as Ambassador Jeffries put it, one more building block in sort of a general architecture, one more thing weaving the countries together, with the specter of China, certainly, despite the protestations from the United States.
I would just add on this economic security element. I see it in terms of building resiliency, because I think one of the things that have come out of the recent challenges, whether it's the pandemic and the supply chain break, as well as the Belt and Road Initiative and the kind of integration that China is doing, China's economic statecraft is something that a country like India alone cannot challenge or contest by itself, even if in its own neighborhood. Therefore, having this kind of a vehicle that has this context and focusing on security, like energy security, food security, critical infrastructure, I think those are the ways in which you are giving a alternative to some of these countries to at least meet somewhat China's sort of overarching economic influence. So in that way, I do see it as a kind of having that security, but competing at that level, because that's where China is competing.
Let me pose a thought that comes to mind, which is this is in many ways a sort of diplomatic equivalent of a happy story, right? We got capital, technology, markets, countries that all objectively want to find things to celebrate amongst them. And each country, as we've established, has reasons to do that. But what happens when I don't know, Goldman Sachs or somebody says, well, we'd really like to invest in this this transport project in India with Israeli, what's it, Waze based technology and a whole bunch of money from the UAE, but the provincial authorities or the national authorities have these laws or policies which prevent it. And then the thing goes from essentially a happy, positive, we're going to announce something new, to the equivalent of the U.S.-European Union dialogue, where it's all problems. We talk about, endless difficulties, geographical origin indications and things like that. These are difficult, hard problems because they have the policies that essentially hold back trade and investment are rooted in the politics of the various countries. We don't want to give up Buy America to Europeans. When that happens, I think that's when you'll see the maturity or otherwise of this organization. I mean, I think that Prime Minister Modi will have a hard time, or for that matter, MBZ in the United Arab Emirates, if the other partners say, well, we'd like to invest in this sector or that sector, but your rules are not allowing us on security grounds to be involved in that. And that's what worries me, that something that is adopted with such positivity, then actually, if it's really effective, then you're going to get into the difficulties.
I think you're right, and I'll say briefly that there have been a couple of instances in which the UAE has pledged investments or wanted to invest in India. I'm most thinking of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company in a refinery in Maharashtra, along with Saudi Aramco, but that has come across all sorts of stumbling blocks, right? So then when that comes across
protection for domestic companies,
right, but when that happens, it's just okay. That's normal course of business. But to your point, is okay, does that tarnish the I2U2, right? In a way, and does it become part of the and maybe even add another layer to it? Does it elevate to I2U2 discussions, right? Can this be a mechanism to solve some of these disputes? I think that's interesting as well to watch how that plays out.
Okay.
To the extent, Charlie, that there is room for political intervention in these things, and I think that's probably higher in India and in the Emiratis than in the U.S. or Israel. I'm thinking of the problems you've had with your gas exploration. Then a good relationship built by things like I2U2 among the leaders who are responsible for that facilitates people biting the political bullet and putting one through.
One hopes. I have one more question from the field.
Yes, hi. My name is Brooke Sherman. I work for the Middle East program, and I'd like to put forth two questions that we received from our online audience. They go together. So the first one is, do all of the I2U2 country governments provide financial support, and if so, in what form? And a second question is, how do global economic crises such as hyperinflation affect political support for the I2U2 forum?
Who would like to tackle that? Maybe one
Sure.
tour de table, and then we'll
Sure.
wrap up.
In terms of providing financial support, the way I understand it is that there isn't particular financial support, and it's project by project, and so a government entity may provide financial support for a particular project, but not as an entity wide. Is that how you understand it as well?
Yeah, that's how the document lays it out.
Right.
I mean, I2U2 is still very early. We're talking about something that was just invented and is sort of it's a package in search of a mission, to be perfectly honest. And I think
a meeting in search of
a mission. And I think the mission has been provided. There's a document. There is real substance here. I would venture a guess that the projects already underway would probably have happened even without I2U2. Nonetheless, I think it doesn't have an enormous downside. And so it does offer real perspective real advantages that I think many of us have touched on. But in that sense, there's no funds behind it. There's not even one staff member anywhere in the world who's devoted solely to I2U2. And that's a question going forward. And I think, Ambassador, your excellent question before, what happens when regulatory issues really come to the fore? That would be the question: is does I2U2 actually bite? Does it actually mean something? Can they get over these kinds of hurdles? And it depends partly on political obstacles. So I'll just add to that. We already touched on the question of what happens with changes of government. The Israeli case, which I suspect the new old prime minister will be very positive towards these partners, even if he doesn't love the title I2U2. In the United States, it's an open question. I agree very much with Ambassador Jeffries. It's probably we're going to see continuity. But also if we see new crises, not just economic crises worldwide, but the West Bank is teetering on eruption and could easily erupt with the new government. It's not only Netanyahu is going to come into government. We're going to have a very, very different government in Israel very soon. We could see a very different reality. It could put new strains on the relationships. I'm guessing the UAE relationship will continue, but that's a guess. It depends what kind of crisis we see, if any. I'm no prophet. There may be none. So because it's still embryonic, it has enormous potential, but I'd also just caution. It also could teeter if there is new crises, and it also doesn't yet have behind it the heft that you would see from more mature gatherings.
Yeah, even institutions with very formal in-writing responses to unforeseen negative events, in the case you had cited, hyperinflation, sometimes fail to use those. I'm thinking most recently of the NATO Charter in the case of the strikes in Poland, and any number of occasions with the UN Security Council. But organizations that don't have formal action plans in writing, the G7 would be one, the Coalition to Defeat ISIS that I played a role in another, actually are often able to find ways to respond to Deus Ex Machina events because of the cooperation built up among the leaders of this group and the sunk costs of that and typically many other engagements with each other.
I just want to say one word, that I think the bilateral relationships between each of these is extremely strong and tested. And so I think that is what brings more heft to this organization than if it didn't have that. And I think also I would have to say that, and from my colleagues too, I think the role of India is key for a variety of reasons. And it's, I think, the one that is, in some sense, at least politically very committed, even if it hasn't put money behind it and so forth. And the government in charge is going to be there for good or bad. It will be there, and that's going to be continuous, I think.
Well, there you have it. Thank you to all who have watched online. Thank you to those in the room. Thank you to my distinguished panel. We have turned over all the letters in the I2U2, looking for better understanding. Maybe we'll come back next year and see how we did. Thank you.
Thank you very much.